Imagine a scenario. You meet someone and there's an instant connection. They radiate kindness and warmth, laugh genuinely at your jokes, and listen attentively to your every word. You feel seen, protected, and most importantly, understood. It seems like you've found a kindred spirit, someone who sees the real you. But suddenly, out of the blue, something inexplicable happens. This person, who seems so close and understanding, suddenly unleashes a barrage of accusations. You're accused of things you've never done, of actions that are foreign to you. Lies, manipulations, comparisons to others. All of this flies at you like poisoned arrows. You stand there, stunned and speechless. The pain pierces you, but even more confusing is the complete lack of logic in what's happening. It seems as if this person was seeing someone else entirely, a stranger to you. Fragments of memories begin to flash through your mind, and you try to understand where you went wrong. Maybe you said something wrong, missed some important signal. Were you too distant or, conversely, too clingy? Doubts begin to gnaw at your mind. You question your adequacy, your memory, your worth as a person. But what if the root of the problem lies not in you? What if the reason for such behavior lies deeper? As Carl Jung once noted, everything that irritates us about others can lead to a deeper understanding of ourselves. But what if some people are so afraid of this understanding that they prefer to destroy the mirror rather than see their own reflection? What if their accusations are just a way to avoid facing themselves, their fears, and their shortcomings? We'll be talking about the shadow side of human nature, those aspects of personality that an individual carefully avoids, suppresses, and hides until they burst out with destructive force. We'll examine how this explosion manifests itself, how it intrudes into various spheres of life, interpersonal relationships, family ties, the toxic work environment, and even global processes. It's important to realize that the person making the accusations may not even realize they're lying, as it's a manifestation of their own shadow. Until the ability to recognize these projections is developed, a person will continue to find themselves in situations where people smile hypocritically to their face but are plotting treacherous plans behind their back. However, by the end of the narrative, the reader will be able to identify projections, protect their consciousness from someone else's madness, and stop mistakenly taking someone else's darkness for their own reflection. This isn't just a psychological analysis, but a matter of survival in a complex world. Therefore, it's worth paying close attention to information that can protect you from a hidden attack that leaves no visible traces, but destroys something much deeper inside. In everyone's life, there comes a moment that's difficult to explain until they personally encounter a similar experience. For example, a person works diligently, always completes their work on time, shows dedication, and even does more than required. But their boss constantly reproaches them for laziness. This boss micromanages every step but avoids any responsibility when problems arise. In such a situation, a person begins to doubt themselves, wondering, maybe I'm really not doing enough? Maybe I really am lazy. Or for example, a person starts a romantic relationship that seems promising. But as the connection deepens, the partner begins to accuse them of emotional coldness and aloofness. The person is confused because they have been open and vulnerable, even more so than usual. Nevertheless, the partner declares, "You never really let me into your world," and then suddenly disappears, like a ghost. Until a person realizes one important aspect of human psychology, what's happening around them may seem meaningless. The people around them see not themselves, but only their own reflection, their personal shadow. This term, introduced by Carl Jung, refers to the hidden aspects of our psyche, those that we stubbornly deny, suppress, and hide deep inside. The shadow holds everything we don't want to admit about ourselves: envy, rage, cowardice, cruelty, and even our most secret desires. However, the more we deny our shadow, the more power it gains over us. After all, what we turn away from within ourselves begins to haunt us in the external world. For example, a boss who constantly accuses a subordinate of laziness may actually be experiencing a deep sense of their own incompetence and fear of responsibility. A partner who reproaches emotional unavailability is afraid of real intimacy. A person who accuses others of lying may have built their entire personality on deception. It's not just hypocrisy, it's psychological projection. a defense mechanism where people unconsciously transfer their own darkness onto others. They accuse those around them of the very flaws they cannot acknowledge in themselves. It's like a haunted house filled with distorted mirrors where warped reflections bounce off every surface. Each person is essentially battling their own inner ghost, projecting it onto those around them. The greatest danger of projection lies in its involuntary nature. People who are prone to it aren't pretending. They genuinely believe they are right. Their minds, seeking to protect the ego, rewrite reality, making the accusations seem justified. As Jung astutely observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is precisely what happens with projection. It deprives a person of the ability to see their own shortcomings, transferring them onto others. As a result, another person becomes a screen onto which someone else's nightmares are played out. This phenomenon isn't exceptional, it's ubiquitous. Consider the friend who constantly spreads gossip, but warns against trusting people. Or the parent who fumes about disrespect, but belittles everyone around them. Or the social media user who criticizes narcissism, but can't resist creating and posting selfies. The shadow side of personality isn't exclusive to serial killers and sociopaths. It's present in ordinary people, in a colleague, a partner, a best friend, and even in oneself. Everyone has their own shadow, but the difference lies in how they deal with it. Some find the strength to face it, while most prefer not to. It is the latter who pose the greatest danger, as they live their lives blaming others for what they hide within themselves. They mistake directness for aggression, honesty for insult, and the setting of personal boundaries is perceived as abandonment issues. Disagreement with their opinion is unacceptable because it threatens their fragile illusion. The successes of others are perceived as personal failures, and an attempt to distance oneself from them is seen as exposing their inner emptiness. To survive, they convince themselves that the villain is anyone but themselves. That's why sudden attacks from the outside seem so illogical and frightening. It's not just betrayal, it's psychological dissonance, where a person fights their inner demons using someone else's name. If an individual isn't aware of the mechanism of projection, they involuntarily begin to internalize its consequences, shouldering a burden of guilt that doesn't belong to them and apologizing for misdeeds they didn't commit. They begin to diminish their virtues to avoid causing discomfort to others and question their own truth simply because someone else isn't able to accept theirs. However, once a person understands the essence of projection, their perception of the world changes dramatically. They stop taking everything personally and absorbing someone else's chaos, mistakenly believing it's their fault. Instead, they begin to quickly recognize warning signs such as unjustified anger, exaggerated accusations, and inconsistent stories. Behind all this is a person who, while yelling at others, is actually yelling at a part of themselves, even though they don't yet realize it. Some people don't just carry a shadow, they become it. At first glance, they may seem charming, self-confident, charismatic, and persuasive. They speak with unwavering certainty and offer clarity in chaos. For a moment, there's a temptation to believe them. However, beneath this mask of confidence lies something dark. Carl Jung warned about such a transformation, calling it ego inflation. When the ego grows to an immoderate size and consumes the entire psyche of a person, they no longer have a shadow because they themselves become the shadow. Examples of such people are cult leaders claiming divine revelation, narcissistic influencers preaching authenticity while meticulously filtering every aspect of their lives, and fanatics dividing the world into us and them, preaching morality while inciting hatred. These people don't just deny their darkness, they use it as a weapon. They create enemies to avoid meeting themselves, turning guilt into accusation, fear into rage, and doubt into dogma. If you listen closely, you can hear their true intentions. They seek to hurt those around them because they hate the truth and believe that only they have awakened, while everyone else remains blind. They think in absolute categories and demand unconditional loyalty. If someone disagrees with them, they're not just wrong, they're dangerous and an embodiment of evil. It's no longer just a projection, but a projection amplified by power, which makes it deadly. The moment a person becomes convinced of their moral infallibility and absolute righteousness, they become capable of anything. History is full of examples of leaders who came to power promising salvation, but ultimately plunged nations into madness. They pointed to some external group, whether heretics, outsiders, or the impure, claiming that they were the cause of all problems. And people believe them because an inflated ego speaks with confidence, and confidence has a seductive power. Don't succumb to the deceptive sense of certainty that a person can exude. Behind the ostentatious self-assurance and inflated ego often lies a vulnerable, frightened personality, desperately in need of recognition and a sense of self-worth. Moreover, the deeper the inner wound, the louder and more demonstrative the behavior becomes. As Carl Jung once observed, the more significant the mask a person wears, the less remains of their true soul. When this mask grows to the scale of a deity, the soul practically disappears, and the person ceases to question anything. They lose the ability to think critically, reflect, and listen to the opinions of others. Instead, they begin to project their inner fears and shortcomings onto those around them, creating entire systems that attract followers and use algorithms to spread their ideas. Such a person builds an echo chamber around themselves, in which their own beliefs find only confirmation, and gradually rewrites reality according to their worldview. Soon, those who follow them begin to see the world in a distorted light, divide into hostile camps, where everything is presented in black and white. It may seem that this phenomenon is unique to extremists, but it's enough to look around to see its manifestations in various spheres of life. It could be an influencer who publicly condemns toxic behavior, but behind closed doors allows themselves to bully others. Or a self-development guru who promises healing but demands unconditional worship in return. Or an activist who starts by fighting for justice but gradually becomes addicted to a sense of outrage and a desire for purity. The moment a person ceases to see themselves as an ordinary mortal, they lose the ability to treat others as equals. When their ego swells to godlike proportions, anyone who dares to disagree with them is perceived as a threat, and threats must be dealt with. They must be controlled, silenced, or even destroyed. This monster doesn't hide in the shadows. It's difficult to recognize. It stands in the spotlight, smiles, gives inspiring speeches, becomes a trendsetter, and sincerely believes in its own lies. This is what makes it especially dangerous. It doesn't think it's manipulating those around it. It's convinced it's saving them. In reality, it feeds on the attention it receives, fueled by people's need for certainty, exploiting their fear of being alone, making a mistake, or getting lost in life. It offers them a ready-made map, a clear goal, and an image of the enemy. But this map leads to a labyrinth. The goal is to establish control, and the enemy has never been who it's trying to convince others it is. Carl Jung deeply understood that when an individual is entirely consumed by their ego and loses the ability to self-criticize, they become susceptible to a kind of obsession. This isn't about demonic influence, but about a rigid, unwavering belief in one's own righteousness. Such people don't just ignore their shadow side. They become that shadow themselves, confidently striding in the light of day, leading thousands of followers. The horror is that they don't come across as monsters. On the contrary, they often appear as leaders, mentors, healers, and lovers. However, if you listen carefully, you can discern echoes of their inner wounds, the despair hidden behind the mask of confidence, and the insatiable hunger disguised as charm. And once this becomes clear, this knowledge can no longer be dismissed, because the inflated ego doesn't whisper, it roars. But only those who are still in a state of spiritual slumber hear this roar. Just open Instagram to see them again. Radiant smiles, exuding confidence. And there he is too, energetic, successful, expressing his gratitude daily. Their lives seem flawless, but something still isn't right. Jung called this the persona, the social mask we wear to adapt to society. It's not just a facade, it's a functional tool. Everyone uses different masks at work, in communication with parents or friends. But in the modern world, this mask isn't just worn, It's sold, filtered, and perfected. Social media has turned the persona into a commodity, a brand, a lifestyle. We no longer strive to express our true selves, but merely portray who we want to appear to be. We carefully rehearse our smiles, rehearse photo captions, and delete anything that might spoil the impression. And gradually we begin to believe in the image we have created. However, here lies a paradox. The brighter and more attractive the mask, the darker the shadow it casts. In the modern world, it is not uncommon to see a popular figure who daily broadcasts ideas of universal harmony and love on social media, suddenly at the center of a scandal due to a public nervous breakdown. Or a person who always radiates positivity unexpectedly displays sharp and even cruel aggression. There are also spiritual leaders who preach humility but demand unconditional veneration. Such manifestations are often perceived as hypocrisy, but the true cause lies much deeper and is tragic in nature. These people become hostages of the image they have created, not allowing themselves to admit weakness or express doubts. They fear that the slightest deviation from the idealized mask will reveal their inner confusion and insecurity to the world. As Carl Jung warned, the danger lies not in the persona itself, the social role we play, but in the denial of the shadow, the dark, hidden side of our personality. When a person builds their identity solely on positive qualities, the darkness remains unnoticed, unacknowledged, and unloved. Ultimately, this suppressed darkness bursts out, often at the most inopportune moment and in front of a huge audience. In the age of social media, where everyone strives to create a perfect image, this problem becomes especially relevant. A world filled with smiles, successes, and radiance hides collapsing lives, anxiety, imposter syndrome, and loneliness behind the screens. This is a high price to pay for pretending that everything is okay. It is worth considering how often, when browsing other people's social media feeds, the question arises, why isn't my life like that? How often do you have to post something just to make a good impression, even when you don't feel happy at all? The deception concerns not only those around you, but also yourself. And each time, strengthening your persona, you drive your shadow deeper into the subconscious, exacerbating the internal conflict. The shadow, however, does not disappear in the darkness, but gains strength, becoming a silent observer, patiently awaiting its hour. And when that hour comes, it returns without warning, undermining the harmony of relationships, whispering doubts and insecurities, and inflicting sudden blows. For if a person does not consciously provide a place for their shadow, it forcibly and uncontrollably penetrates their existence. It was this deep understanding that drove Carl Jung. Genuine integrity of personality is achieved not by polishing the external mask, but by discarding it, even temporarily. It is born from self-analysis, from the ability to withstand discomfort and acknowledge, I am not only light, but also darkness. This is not a manifestation of weakness, but a sign of maturity and strength. After all, when a person accepts their dark side, no one can use it against them. Accepting your shortcomings deprives others of the opportunity to shame you. And when the mask is dropped, even for a moment, it allows others to free themselves from theirs. The persona as a social role will always be an integral part of human existence. It is necessary for interacting with the world. However, when the mask begins to be perceived as the true face, the connection with the authentic self is lost. Therefore, the next time you browse a feed of perfect images, remember that you are only seeing a costume, not an honest admission, a carefully staged performance, not a real person. And perhaps the most valuable thing you can do is to give up the desire to look flawless. Imagine a situation, a conversation is flowing smoothly, when suddenly the other person changes their tone, their voice becomes louder and their words sound like accusations of selfishness, insensitivity, and a tendency to manipulate. You freeze in bewilderment, trying to understand what had happened, because none of these accusations seem fair. But here lies the danger. The thought creeps into your head, what if they're right? And now you start to make excuses, feel guilty, and take on someone else's shame. This is how projection manifests itself. As Carl Jung said, what irritates us in others can push us towards self-knowledge. However, it is worth adding that not all criticism deserves attention. Sometimes it hides a veiled admission of one's own shortcomings. How can you protect yourself from someone else's projection and not become its victim? How do you recognize that someone is trying to shift their shadow onto you? Pay attention to the following signs. Sudden emotional outbursts, when even a minor remark causes a violent reaction. Such disproportion indicates that it is not about you. The disconnect between accusations and your actions. Being called aggressive when you're calm, or cruel when you simply set boundaries. This discrepancy may indicate that your behavior has touched on sensitive issues the other person is unwilling to confront. Intense emotional swings, where warmth turns to coldness, security to anxiety, admiration to attacks, are also indicators. Projection often stems from unacknowledged emotional pain, which, when unleashed, destabilizes everything around it. Descriptions of you in extremes, using words like always, never, everything, nothing, are other signs to watch out for. Such absolute statements rarely reflect reality and are more often attempts to control the situation and fit you into a convenient narrative, allowing them to avoid facing their own shadow. Recognizing these signs isn't paranoia. It's a sign of awareness and a willingness to protect yourself from someone else's negativity. A defensive reaction is one of the most common responses to projection from others. There's an acute desire to justify yourself, clarify, and convince the opponent that they're wrong. However, experience shows that attempts at persuasion are doomed to failure in this case. It's impossible to logically dispel someone else's emotional wounds. If someone has already concluded that you are their adversary, no evidence to the contrary will work, because the struggle isn't with objective facts, but with subjective perceptions created to protect their own self. And instead of engaging in a pointless argument, it's recommended to pause, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, does this accusation align with my self-perception? If the answer is no, the best solution is to refuse to defend yourself and distance yourself from the situation. Let the person deal with their internal contradictions independently. There's no need to get involved in someone else's conflict. This is the essence of emotional boundaries, being able to observe what's happening from the outside without getting emotionally involved. Acquiring this skill takes time and practice. As a mental exercise, you can imagine that at the moment of projection, you're holding a mirror, not a shield. You're not blocking the negativity, but simply reflecting it back. There's no need to say anything or get into an argument. It's important to perceive the situation as it is, as a manifestation of another person's inner world spilling out. At the same time, it's necessary to stay centered. Grounding practices help with this. Feeling the support under your feet, slowing down your breathing, and concentrating on physical sensations. These simple actions allow you to return to your body and not let someone else's emotions overwhelm you. People prone to projecting often have heightened empathy and a desire for compassion. They're driven by a sincere desire to understand others, provide support, and bring positive changes to their lives. However, good intentions, lacking due diligence, can lead to undesirable consequences. Therefore, it's crucial to develop a habit of self-analysis and critical evaluation of what's happening. First of all, it's necessary to learn to distinguish your own feelings and experiences from those imposed from the outside. It's important to ask yourself questions. What do I really feel? Does this person's perception of me align with my own opinion of myself? It's equally important to realize whether you have to sacrifice your own individuality and self-worth in order to meet someone else's expectations and fit into someone else's worldview. In this process, keeping a journal where you can record your thoughts, feelings, and observations can be an indispensable aid. Psychotherapy, which allows you to understand yourself and your relationships with others, is also a useful tool. Even a few minutes of daily reflection on yourself and your life can bring tangible benefits. The deeper a person knows themselves, the harder it is for someone who doesn't have such self-reflection to manipulate them. It's worth noting that some people don't just sporadically project their feelings and experiences onto others. They live in this state constantly. They've built their identity on denying their own shortcomings and problems, shifting them onto others. Being around such people is like wandering through a maze of distorted mirrors, where everything is reflected in a distorted way. In such situations, the most effective protection is to establish clear boundaries and distance yourself from the source of negative impact. A person has every right to say, "This energy isn't for me," and choose a path that leads to peace of mind and harmony. Let others call it selfishness. It's first of all a manifestation of common sense and self-care. It's important to remember that no one is obliged to correct someone else's mistakes and heal someone else's wounds. A person isn't a sponge that absorbs someone else's pain and suffering. He is first and foremost a soul striving for light and self-realization. In the world of human relationships, the phenomenon of projection plays a significant role, but a person's inner strength can become a reliable defense. When someone tries to shift their own negative qualities onto another, it's important not to succumb to this manipulation. Instead of fighting someone else's shadow, one should recognize what is happening. Understanding the situation becomes a kind of armor, and self-confidence opens the way to resolving the conflict. Consider a typical example. When meeting a new person, there is a feeling of warmth and security, but suddenly they begin to make unfounded accusations. At such a moment, it is important to realize that this person is not actually addressing you, but rather the part of themselves that they are trying to hide. You have merely become an unwitting mirror, reflecting what they cannot accept in themselves. As a result, there's an attempt to destroy this reflection, which leads to confusion, doubt, and guilt. However, this is not a manifestation of madness, but an act of projection, where someone else's shadow is trying to survive by shifting the blame onto another. Realizing this fact fundamentally changes the situation. There is no longer a need to carry the burden of someone else's wounds or adapt to their shortcomings. There is no need to fight, justify oneself, or prove one's innocence, because the true nature of what is happening becomes obvious. As Carl Jung once remarked, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Often, people strive to be good, understood, and loved, but perhaps true strength lies elsewhere. Real peace and harmony are found not when we are seen, but when we ourselves gain clarity of vision. It is important to remain calm in moments of confusion, to observe manifestations of cruelty without taking them personally, and to realize that the source of aggression is within another person, not in front of you. Perhaps the true purpose of a person is not to fight monsters, not to play the role of a savior, and not to always strive to be right, but to be able to see in the dark. Once a person acquires this ability, no one can force them to carry someone else's shadow, to take someone else's pain as their own, or to forget about their own essence. This is awareness, maturity, and true strength. It is impossible to avoid projection by avoiding people, but one can learn to see through it, to see people as they are, and despite everything, to make one's own choices.